Okay, so today we'll be touching a very interesting topic, which we don't discuss too much in the ICUs, is nutrition in intensive care unit. Uh, this topic, what we are going to discuss today, is the practical aspects of nutrition in intensive care. We'll not go into too much meticulous details in different guidelines. We have prepared this session, we have reviewed this session by comparing SPEN guideline means American, European, Irwin repeat text of intensive care medicine, O's manual of intensive care, Washington manual of intensive care, and up to date. So out of all these, what we have compiled is the points which we need to address, we need to discuss when we are talking of nutrition in ICU. Also, we have been helped by our chief dietitian, Miss Priya, and dietitian Ruchi also in preparing and explaining certain facts because they are dealing with this patient, describing the diet chart daily in ICU. So let's begin. So the first point here is why it is necessary to provide nutrition in intensive care. The basic difference between nutrition in intensive care and a general population is that in your ICU, the patient is in a catabolic state. The patient is suffering from different diseases. The patient is in stress. Your adrenaline levels are high. Your insulin levels are high, and the patient remains is a diseased person. So the nutrition is body mechanics is in a catabolic state, not anabolic. So we need to consider two aspects. One, we need to treat the pre-existing malnutrition, whether there is a weight loss of this patient previously, or this patient is malnourished in terms of obese patient can also be malnourished. It's a type of malnutrition. Whether there is some malignancy, whether there is a cachexia disease, whether there is the patient was not able to eat properly because of bedridden status. So there is some pre-existing malnutrition, and also to minimize muscle wasting. The patient remains on the bed most of the time in the ICUs, so there is a muscle wasting also. So we need to address all this issue. What we want that we need to correct the previous malnutrition and also prevent muscle wasting and provide the nutrition which is required to treat the patient in terms of its critical illness, in terms of to fight the disease, in terms of increase immune response towards infections. So next is, how do you assess? Can somebody sit here and when I do ask? So how do you assess? Before the start of this meet, this fellow person was asking, sir, how will we assess the nutrition status? Is there some tool with us? Is there some scoring system with us? Do we have some lab parameters, or it's only the clinical judgment? Actually, there are three tools which they frequently use, but they are very cumbersome to use in the ICUs. So even if you have those tools, you know about those tools in the ICU. Nutrix score is the other, but in a busy ICU to follow them, it's a little bit challenging. Not in Indian context, but everywhere in every part of the world. Secondly, so scoring systems are there, but if you are doing a study, if you are doing some planning, if you are meticulously focusing on certain aspects of nutrition for your ICU study or trial, you can use scoring system because it standardizes the process. Second, are there any lab parameters? You send some investigation as soon as the patient get admitted, and by which you can know what is the nutrition status of this patient. So there are not many, but one thing I we have seen is phosphorus, if can be sent on admission, gives you a little bit idea about what's the nutrition status, because whether if it is severely malnourished, then phosphorus level will be low. So you need to take care of feeding gradually. But if it is normal, that doesn't mean that a patient is not malnourished. So there are not many parameters by which you can lab parameters by which you can assess the nutrition status. Albumin, most of the people say that if albumin is low, the nutritional status is a little bit low in this patient, but it is actually affected by lots of factors. If a patient is dehydrated, your albumin levels may come up. If a patient has a renal disease or cirrhotic disease, the albumin levels may go down. Also, it's an inflammatory marker, so its level can fluctuate. So, albumin per se doesn't have any nutritional value in assessing the nutrition status of the patient. So, albumin should not be used. So, what we are left with? We are left with your bedside clinical judgment of the patient. So, bedside judgment depends how you'll do. One, category of patient. If it's a trauma patient, if it's a burn patient, if it's a sepsis patient, it's a post-op patient, it's a post-malignancy patient. So you have a certain idea that this patient's requirement of nutrition is little bit high. Trauma patient's requirement will be high, burn patient requirements will be high, malignancy patient requirements will be high, and your septic patient. So, by post-op, pre-op history, you will have some idea that this particular patient will require more nutrition, more protein to have wound healing, like abdominal surgeries, because you require proteins to heal the wounds. Secondly, weight of the patient. How much is the weight? Because this will decide further how much nutrition you should give to the patient, depending on the weight-based calorie weight system, which we'll see in the later part of the session. We'll have a particular example from the ICU and we'll calculate the nutrition requirement. So, type of patient, weight of the patient, and few clinical parameters, of which very important is oral health. If you see the how is the oral hygiene of the patient before coming to ICU. If your patient is having tooth pain, having dentures, or mouth care is not that good, patient was bedridden, you definitely that patient will be having some trouble in taking foods. If there is ulceration in the tongue, if its mouth is too much dry, how is the tongue valley? So this gives you an idea that whether this patient was eating properly before coming to your intensive care unit or not taking. So always check for oral health. But oral health is good, that means fair enough nutrition was there. If the oral health is poor, that means there was some difficulty in taking the nutrition. Like neuro patient, they don't eat properly because they are dependent on others to feed them. Skin turgor can give you some idea, but it's not very reliable in cirrhotic patient, cardiac failure patients, renal patients. But at least you can have an idea if it if the skin turgor is low, means if the skin turgor is not very tight, patient may be dehydrated or you may require. But skin scaling, some patients have scalings on their body, feet, calf muscles, and on the generalized. So these patients are usually malnourished and they have a micro element deficiency, selenium, other zinc, other deficiencies. So you need to be aware that these needs to be supplemented. Assessment of the muscle mass by diameter is not very helpful. Fat loss also you need to judge clinically, but in bedside assessment, again, category of the patient, what's the previous history, what's the weight, and you can have two, three things which can help you a bedside assessment that, okay, roughly this much enough this patient, whether this patient is malnourished, whether this patient was okay, or this patient is malnourished in terms of excessive weight, obesity. So this you can have. Drop on the slide. Now, when we have done the nutritional assessment, third, patient selection timing of support means when to feed. You have a patient, you have done the assessment, now when to start feeding. So first question, if you answer these two questions, then you will get the answer. How long is it safe to leave critically patient without nutrition? How long we can make this patient not fed? Suppose I have a stroke patient. Suppose I have a trauma patient. Suppose I have a sepsis patient. So when should I start feeding? Secondly, if we can wait for certain period of time, so then when to start? If we are waiting for 24 hours, 40 hours, 72 hours, when it's the time we should start the feeding? And does hemodynamics matter? Hemodynamics matter means whether a patient is hemodynamically stable or whether unstable. See what happens when we'll discuss this point. Whenever patient is hemodynamically unstable, patient is you have given fluid challenges and still the patient is on multiple vasopressor supports. You want all the energy, all the blood supply and calories to maintain the hemodynamics of the patient. The and the body what does, bowel supply of a bowel is little bit reduced. It is sent to the periphery. So bowel is at a risk of low supply blood flow is there. So absorption will not be that much high. If you feed the patient, then will become a difficult challenge for the body, because then body needs to shift the blood from the required part to the bowel for the feeding, and therefore if it is not going to help, then there will be necrosis, there will be gastric aspirate, there can be intolerance, all sort of things. It will disturb the hemodynamics also. So make sure you, as fast as you can, you make the patient hemodynamically stable. We'll see, discuss if the patient is not stable for 24, 48 hours, what we can try, how we can feed. But the first thing you should do is you make the patient hemodynamically stable as much as you can in first 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours then. So when should you start? Different guidelines say different thing, S1, S1, but the idea is roughly all those say that you start feeding within 24 to 48 hours. Means your nutrition is also sort of medication, which you need to start as early as possible. We will go not 24, 48 hours, we'll go with as early as possible. Ideally, it should be started within 24 hours. If you can not fast for one day, how you will live if you don't have a meal on time, your body will start craving. So that patient is already in a state of catabolism, it will require nutrition. So you should start the feeds as early as possible, preferably within 24 to 48 hours, and you should have your hemodynamics stabilized as much as you can. Next point. So so nutritional requirements, you just enter okay, so sure. Fourth is how much is the neutral. You have patient, you have judged the patient, you have decided that I am going to feed this patient. So how much do you need to feed? This is very important concept. Based on this, we'll do the calculation in the later part of the session. Different guidelines, different trials they have done, many trials they have done. Exact consensus nobody has come to, but roughly they say you should feed somewhere between 25 to 35 kilocalorie per kg per day. This much amount of calorie you should feed the patient. So if we take 30, if we suppose we say 30 kilocalorie, so a 70 kg person needs to 2100 calories per day. Now the question is how you are going to feed this. Suppose you need to give 2100 or roughly 2000 calories a day. So out of those calories, what you need to give? Protein should comprise 1 to 1.5 gram per kg per day. Earlier it was 1, but now they've increased to 1 to 1.2 to 1.5. If we calculate by 1, so 70 kg person requires 70 gram of proteins per day. Next, Niche. Now, 1 gram of protein provides how much calorie? 4 kilocalorie. So 70 into 4, how much calorie will be there? 2800 to 280 kilocalorie. So remaining out of this, if we see is 300. So out of 2100, there will be 17 or 1800 kilocalories will there. Out of those, 60% should be provided by carbohydrates, 40% should be provided by lipids, and the rest you should need to supplement micronutrients and take care of the electrolytes. So we'll come back to this when we discuss a case. We'll discuss one patient and we'll calculate the chart how you are going to provide this. So roughly 25 to 30 kilocalorie per kg you need to provide per day. Now route. Next is route of nutrition. You have decided that I'm going to give this much calorie. So which route should be preferred? Enteral route or parenteral? There is no doubt now that it's always the enteral route which is preferred. Feed normally. We take feed by enteral route, so we should give feed enterally. Now, why they say enterally? They have, if you ask me, the biggest point is it's cheaper and easy to give. any readily available. This is the biggest benefit. Secondly, different studies and different guidelines have told, literature have shown that there is improved gut mucosal integrity. If you have something there, if you have something there in the gut, that gut will keep remain active. Enhanced immune responsiveness. There are lymphocytes there in the GI tract, which you call MALT, or the other type of layers are there. Preventing bacterial dislocation. Gut is filled with bacteria. If bowel becomes ischemic, if bowel is not functioning, then it will bacteria will dislocate, go in the blood and can flare up the sepsis. So enteral nutrition has non-nutritional benefits also, which is very important in fighting the disease against infection and also not increasing the burden of infection. So enteral route is preferred. How will you feed? If possible, oral, always orally it should be there. Then next is nasogastric. Nasogastric is the most preferred route if the patient is not able to take orally. At times there can be intolerance, there can be aspirate. We'll discuss this. So you can go to nasovaginal also, but this required under vision. You need to provide different tubes. So it's not easy. Then you have peg feeds, bedridden patients. If you feel that this patient is going to have this sort of feeding for more than 4 weeks, then you should shift to peg feed. Then, and if this is not possible, we will come to parenteral. Okay. Now, uh, come to 6 point. So you have an RT place. Suppose we are assuming that our patient has a nasogastric tube in place. How will you feed? Tropic feed or full volume based feeding? Means tropic feed means you start with a little amount, you gradually increase and reach up to a certain level, your target levels in 2 to 3 days. This is tropical feeding. Full means you from day one, from the first feed, you start with the full feeding. So it depends. It depends, but the studies say, the literature say that if you are deciding to feed the patient and there is no contraindication, straight away start with the full feed. But just because I'm in the ICU doesn't mean I have to starve for 2 3 days. Give me the food which I require. How much? If patient is good enough, no contraindication, start with full feeds. Then, but topical feeds are helpful if there is a bowel is ischemic or you have a sepsis patient is there, patient is unstable. You start with somewhere around 25 to 30 ml per hour, 30 ml per hour feeds. If tolerates, gradually increase up to whatever a required amount. At times they use volume-based feeding. Volume-based feeding means they calculate what is the required amount in 24 hours. They calculate the volume and they give. Suppose they need to give 2 liters of feeds daily. If 2 liters is not given, if there is a break in between, they supplement with the extra feed. So they decide this much volume we need to give this patient. But tropic or full feed concept is wherever there is no contraindication, don't start with tropical, go away with full feeds. Bolus versus continuous. This is a topic of debate and controversy right from the start, and still it's controversial. I would not say it's controversial, but I would say that each has its own benefits. Each has its own benefits. Natural way, if you ask me, it's bolus because we are bolus eaters. Na? We take 3 4 times food a day. We are not continuous eaters. The problem with bolus feed is in ICU is you have a lot of gastric aspirate. Patient may at times not tolerate the feed, so then you switch to continuous feed. Now, continuous feed is 50 ml per hour. It's go by gravity bag trickling down slowly, and the patient may start accepting enteral feed. But the challenge with continuous feed is biggest disadvantage is your gastric pH is acidic. But if you keep continuous feed to this patient, the pH remains a little alkaline because the continuous feed is there. So that alkaline environment is good for microorganism. And if your patient is on ventilator or patient's cough is not good, the chances of aspiration pneumonia increases drastically. So if this is the biggest disadvantage of continuous feeding. Otherwise, fair enough. But we recommend if the patient is stable, patient is tolerating feed, you should go with bolus feedings. right? Then gastric residual volume assessment. How much aspirate at what time you should do an RT aspirate? Suppose you are giving bolus and continuous, you need to check whether patient is tolerant. So every 4 hours routinely you can check the gastric aspirate. There is a consensus that 50 ml aspirate is there, 100 ml aspirate is there. We should hold the feed, we should stop the feed. But just the recent guidelines told that it's 500 ml. 500 ml feed, if the gastric volume is 500 ml, then only you should consider. But for all practical purposes and other books also, 200 is a reasonable amount. If the patient is having 200 ml of gastric aspirate back after 4 hours, you should think of adding some prokinetic drug. You should think of switching from bolus to continuous. And if it doesn't work out, you should look for other causes of non-tolerance also, hypokalemia, ileus, calcium deficiency, etc. etc. What prokinetic you can use? You can use metoclopramide or erythromycin. The doses are there in the books, but it's metoclopramide, 8-hourly, and erythromycin. But they work only in 48 to 72 hours. Once you've started metoclopramide, suppose a patient having aspirate 200 to 50, 300 aspirate, you started metoclopramide, erythromycin. If it doesn't start tolerating in next 48 72 hours, it means it will not tolerate. So then you need to shift to parenteral one. So their effect comes within 1 or 2 days. That point is clear. Okay. So regimen now. Composition. So now you have decided everything. I have put a Ralph's tube. I have decided I will give bolus feed. Up now, what we need to feed? So, so composition is polymeric and enabler. Polymeric means polymers are there. It's a food which we are eating in supplemental forms. Also, polymerics is there. Carbohydrate, fat, proteins are there. Body needs to break down those and then need to absorb. So if there is no, if a bowel is intact, the patient will accept polymeric feeds. If patient is not able to absorb because of some gastric malfunction, then you should switch to semi-elemental, which is it was elemental, semi-elemental. So it has amino acids, peptides, which can be readily absorbed by the bowel mucosa. They don't have to do lots of breakdown of this food. So if the bowel is not, some pancreatitis patients, a bowel surgery patients, we supplement with semi-elemental so that they can absorb the readily pre-breakdown products. Clear? Complications. Most common and most overlooked complication of enteral feeding, nasojejunal feeding, nasogastric, nasojejunal feeding is sinusitis. You need to compress this. How to check? You need to compress the sinuses daily at least once so that you can see whether there is a tenderness, whether there is some pain, whether on the side, because blockage of the nasal terminates cause sinusitis. It is one of the one of the causes of pyrexia of unknown origin in the ICU. Easily overlooked because sinusitis it can cause fever. You have done everything, but you are not getting any cause of fever. So sinusitis is one. Ventilator associated pneumonia, I have told you, is common if transgastral residual volume are there, the patient is not able to cough out properly, or the patient is sedated. If you have not propped down, aspiration pneumonia chances are there, more with continuous feeding. To prevent this, the single most thing which is very important, which is very helpful in preventing VAP is oral care. If you are doing oral care of the patient daily via chlorhexidine and all those things, it helps to prevent VAP. No other measure has shown to decrease the incidence of VAP other than this oral hygiene. Misplacement of trachea and perforation. We have seen that if you apply too much pressure, it can break the trachea, it can perforate the trachea, it can get misplaced into the trachea also if you have not checked properly. This is more common with the perforation is more common with you say fine bore tubes which require a guide wire stellate to get it inserted. If they are inserted under not under supervision or not under endoscopy guidance, they may perforate. So in markets they are available by different tubes, but concept is apply lots of jelly, make the patient a little prop up, do not extend the neck. Because in intubation, we need to extend the neck, we need to see the trachea. So whenever you extend the neck, it's the trachea which comes out first. The chances of getting the tube into the trachea is more. Whenever you need to put the Ryle's tube, you need to flex the neck if it is not going. If it is obviously if it is spine injury, you need to not flex, but make the patient prop instead of extending, little will flex the neck. If a patient can swallow a little sips of water, give him some sips. So the patient will degulate the water. Along with that flow, your Ryle's tube will, nasogastric tube will go down. So it's a very common mistake I see in the nursing. They extend the neck because it's for intubation. It's not for nasogastric tube placement. Diarrhea, one of the most common and feared complication of supplemental feeds, scientific feeds. Diarrhea can be of multiple causes. It could be due to your antibiotic associated diarrhea. It could be due to your other causes, but we are discussing specifically nutrition associated. So it can be due to high osmolar feeds you are giving. Suppose you are giving too much concentrated or supplemental feed, it can cause osmotic diarrhea. Suppose the patient is lactose intolerant. If your composition contains lactose, it will cause diarrhea. And one of the interesting cause of diarrhea which we found out was it's not the feed which was contaminated. So you need to have scoops and then a shaker and mix with the particular amount of fluid and then give to the patient. It with a shaker, if not cleaned with water once a day, it grows bacteria. So if you need to see in which shaker they are mixing the different feed. So that is one of the most commonest and overlooked cause of feeds. We started scientific feeds to the patient. Third, fourth day started developing diarrhea. So you need to check the shaker whether it's been washed or not washed. If you let the feed remain in there, small particles, small 1 or 2 ml is there, then that it gets infected. So whenever your patient on scientific feeds develop diarrhea, always take the shaker in which the feed is being mixed. So if that cause is found, you can do that. Regarding feed, if you are giving high osmolar feed, high concentrated feed, so how do you reduce it? Whether you will dilute it more with more blood, more water, or you will reduce the quantity. So some centers, what they do, suppose they want to give six scoops. So if you are there giving in 130 ml, they put it in 200 ml. So that is not going to help. You need dilution will not help in making the feed tolerate. It's the quantity which helps. You give a little amount of that thing. Don't increase the fluid. Increase and decrease the quantity of that feed. Once start tolerating, gradually build up. So always check the mixing shaker, decrease the osmolarity. You can switch to semi-elementals, and you should look for other causes of diarrhea also. Metabolic complication, usually hyperglycemia is there. Your sugars level can go up, insulin requirement can go up. Certain metabolic disturbances like electrolyte imbalance may happen. Some feeds don't have particular soluble vitamins or insoluble vitamins. Some deficiencies there. You need to check on the box which is not there and you need to supplement them. So these are metabolic complications. Refeeding syndrome, very, very important. Usually, esophageal cancer patients or long time bedridden patients, if they are underfed, they develop hypophosphatemia. If hypophosphatemia, you knew ATP, it is adenosine triphosphate. It's the major building block, energy building block for your in mitochondria to generate energy. Phosphate is a very important component of that. If you are underfed for a longer period of time, you develop hypophosphatemia. So as soon as you start feeding this patient, this the body gets phosphate and it start increasing the machinery. So for that, it start consuming all the electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium, everything start using. So suddenly there is a drip in the all these electrolytes level in the blood, and this can cause life-threatening arrhythmias, seizures. So whenever you have a underfed patient, supplement phosphorus, check phosphorus, and start build gradually. Tropical feed. You start gradually. Don't give the full feed immediately. Also, thiamine and extra other things also needs to be supplemented. Next, now in spite of all efforts, suppose your patient is not able to tolerate parental feed, so enteral feed. So now you need to switch to parenteral nutrition. Now, if I have a patient with a bowel surgery on day one in ICU, will you go for enteral or will you go for parenteral? If you think that this patient for next 4 to 7 days is not going to tolerate oral feed, straight away you start your parenteral nutrition. If you feel this patient in next couple of days, next 2 3 days will start tolerating oral feeds, we will be able to do enteral nutrition, give enteral nutrition. You stick to your routine supplements and then later on start parenteral nutrition. Parenteral nutrition should be given by a central line, and that's the biggest challenge. You need a different dedicated central line to this patient. Some have come up with peripheral TPNs also, but what should be the site? If you ask me what the literature says, so for giving parenteral nutrition, they always recommend subclavian because chances of infections are very low in subclavian. But routinely, which is used in most ICUs in Indian construct is IJV, interjugular. So you dedicate one port to that TPN. The risk of because candida, fungal infections is very high. So which port you should dedicate? You should dedicate the distal one, so that it does whenever the staff is handling that port, it doesn't get too much in contact with the other two ports. So start with the distal port. You dedicate one port to this composition. Again, in TPN, we calorie composition will be like that only. Total calorie, how much giving, protein, how much we are giving, lipids and amino acids. See. Micronutrients, these thiamine, vitamin K, and folic acid are not stable in parenteral feed, so you need to supplement extra. If you are your patient, if you are giving parenteral nutrition, still you need to supplement thiamine, vitamin K, and folic acid separately to this patient. Electrolytes also need a complication of parenteral nutrition. Usually it's fungemia. Usually it's infection, sepsis, which is there. Some hyperglycemia is also some complication. If you totally rely on TPN, then you can develop deficiency of certain other trace elements. Okay. Now, nutrition in specific condition. Why I wrote this? Because I want to clear certain myths that earlier they say that in acute renal failure, don't give protein. Don't give protein. It can develop urea and it can cause encephalopathy. In liver diseases, don't give too much proteins. Also, it can cause encephalopathy. Ammonia can get rise or in respiratory failure, there can be excessive carbohydrate will increase more CO2 and it will cause CO2 retention in COPD patients. So all these have gone away. They say don't supplement extra, but at least give what is required. Normal diet, no high protein, but normal protein diet to this all these patients. Normal carbohydrate diet to this patient. So acute renal failure, liver disease, and respiratory, they should be given normal diet. Means normal protein. You give, don't restrict. Acute pancreatitis, earlier it was the parenteral nutrition which is the cornerstone of therapy. Now it's proven everywhere. It's the enteral nutrition. We need to feed the patient through enteral route by nasogastric or nasojejunal, or at times they do a feeding jejunostomy also. So acute pancreatitis, enteral route is the preferred mode of nutrition. Obesity, why obesity is also a sort of malnourished patient. Nutrition has gone wrong, that's why there's built up lots of fat and all those things. The calorie requirement is a little bit high, but don't underfeed. At least feed them normally. Next, I think I have coming. Adjuvant nutrition. Selenium, glutamine, asparagine, arginine, and omega-3 fatty acids. Different companies, different guidelines in the past have promoted them. Like glutamine can increase your immune system, arginine can provide you antioxidant sort of therapy, immune system, omega-3 fatty acids, and others. But nobody has shown to too much benefit. So now they are not. Glutamine is out of the guidelines. Arginine also is there, but complication with arginine also renal failure and all those are there. So they are not of much help if you are thinking that they will help too much in this patient. You can supplement, but it will be a routine thing. But if you feel that they will enhance drastically the immune system of the body, So routine use is not justified. On case to basis, case to case basis, you can understand that oh, this patient is malnourished for a longer period of time. You can supplement these macronutrients, but supplementing universally in all patients not justified. So now this was the session. Quickly, what we'll do, we'll discuss a case on the whiteboard, and then we'll practically solve how we'll plan the feed in this particular patient. One more very interesting point which our dietitian told is regarding egg. Egg. Suppose this was the supplemental feed. Suppose your patient, you are giving kitchen feed to the patient. So if it is a vegetarian guy, then you have a mix of blends of all soya oils, soya beans, and then dal and other things. But if it is non-vegetarian, you can give egg. So whether it should be given boiled or as it is, it should be given boiled and mash up and give boil, because they told me, I have not gone through this, but there is an enzyme called avidin in there in the egg, which hampers the absorption of biotin protein. The enzyme is avidin, AVIDIN. So when you boil the egg, these enzymes get denatured. So that's why biotin gets absorbed in the stomach. If you give the raw egg, this protein will not get absorbed. So you should give boiled mashed egg is preferred. Secondly, uh, is egg is a bioreference protein. So if you are giving one egg to the patient, how much gram of protein you are giving? 5 grams. One egg equal to 5 grams. Suppose you have a 70-80 requirement per day. If you are giving 4 eggs, so it will give you 20 grams of protein. So we'll solve one case so that you can have an idea from tomorrow that how we can plan the dietitian chart or diet of this patient. We'll switch the board here. Suppose you receive a 70 kg patient in the ICU, 70 kg. How much nutrition you need to provide, calorie provide? 25 to 35 kilocalorie per kg per day. Suppose we take 30. You can have your calculators there. So 70 into 30, 2100 kilocalorie. We need to provide 2100 kilocalorie to this patient in 1 day. So, but we have a requirement of, we will supply this by protein, carbohydrate, and lipid. 1 gram of protein gives 4 calorie. है ना? 1 gram of carbohydrate also gives 4 kilocalorie. No, sorry. So same. And 1 gram of lipid provides 9 kilocalorie. This is the rule. Okay. And protein requirement of this patient will be, if 70 is the 1.2, will start with the lowest. The 1.2 will come up with how much? 84. So we can take here 80, 84 grams. If we can 1.2 gram per kg we will do, so 85. So how much this 84 gram will provide the calorie? 84 into 4. We are providing 84 gram of protein to this patient per day. 1 gram of protein will provide 4 kilocalorie of energy. So 84 into 4, approximately 350. So out of 2100 calorie, 350 will come by protein. So what amount, how much will remain there? 2100 minus 350, 750? 1750? 1750. 1750. Now, out of this 60% should come from carbohydrate and 40% should come from lipid. So how much is the 60% of this 1750? What is the 60% of 1750? 105. This is approximately 1100. So 1100 kilocalorie should come from carbohydrate and remaining 650 kilocalorie should come from lipid. So 1100 will divide by 4. So we'll get the how much gram we need to supplement carbohydrate. 1100 divided by 4. How much? No, 1100 divided by 4. Approximately 300. 300 grams. Oh, milligrams, sorry. And 650 divided by 9, 70. 70 grams. So if we need to provide 2,100 kilocalorie to this patient, we need to provide 84 grams of protein. We need to provide 300 grams of carbohydrate, and we need to provide 70 grams of lipids. So when you're starting a supplemental feed, you should know how much one scoop is providing. So in the next session, when we finish this, we'll give you distribute to this pocket booklet, which will say. So approximately one scoop has somewhere around 41 calorie, 41 or 50. So 50 into 6, you get 300 kilocalorie. So you get 300 grams. That's the formula. So whenever you're switching to scientific feed, you should see that how much 6 scoops are providing, how much per scoop is providing. So every feed, when you calculate in terms of that, you will get an idea how many scoops are providing. When you calculate this on the basis of the formulas and the feed literature given, it will come around normal supplemental feed, 6 scoops of feed, total 8 feeds, and every 6 scoops mixed with 130 ml of water. That's the way you should plan. So 6 scoops, 130 ml of feed, 8 feeds per day. That will give you approximately this much amount of calories to the patient. You get an idea? We have given you this booklet also. In this booklet, on the basis of this booklet, you can also come up with which type of supplemental feed we need to provide. So that was in short about nutrition in ICU. Any doubts and any discussion, you can ask on our forums, and you can ask in the comment section also. Thank you.